So we've talked about some of the abiotic things that go on in ecosystems or that affect ecosystems in terms of biogeochemical cycles. We've talked about the general structure of ecosystems. Now, when we were talking about ecological niches earlier, they include lots of abiotic factors as well. And also, the niche that a creature can technically survive in, an organism can survive in, and the niche it actually occupies can be quite different. Anything that affects the size of a population is a limiting factor. For example, this might include temperature. If you take an Arctic hare into an environment where a desert hare could survive, it'll probably die of overheating. And there's light. There are others such as predators, water, nutrients, cows that do not get enough cobalt will end up sick. This was an issue initially when trying to ranch in New Zealand. Now, here we see some of the ranges that we care about for a population. So outside the tolerance ranges, the animals just get stressed and die. Or the organism in general. Say if you take a plant that's adapted for tropical conditions and you put it into the Arctic, then if this was temperature, well, it dies. If you boil it, or put it in hot water, it dies as well. The optimum range is where the population density is the highest. Now, typically it's able to survive, able to feed, and then able to reproduce once you get into higher grade levels. When you study these, the optimum range is basically they can reproduce. Now, there's a difference between being able to survive, able to feed, and being able to reproduce. For example, if you take a human, being able to survive is fairly easy. But if you are surviving in a state that is so sick and you are barely alive, you cannot even feed yourself properly, which means that you will probably die eventually. Well, that's why being able to feed is actually a smaller range than being able to survive for brief times. For example, you can go through a sauna without dying because you are capable of surviving that briefly. Species can have large ranges or small ranges. For example, black spruce is all over northern North America. This is typically called the boreal forest and taiga. So the specific divisors are up to regional analysts. For the most part, people refer to this as coniferous forest and leave it at that because the distinction between taiga and boreal is relatively less than obvious. It's not like boreal versus deciduous forest. It's like, you look at the trees. Oh, of course this has to be deciduous forest. We see that there's lots of broadleaf plants, such as maple trees, that are known to drop their leaves in fall. Sounds obvious, right? Well, let's look at some key abiotic factors and the effects that humans can have on them. So terrestrial ecosystems, we have light, water, nutrients, and temperature. Human effects, let's think about this. If humans clear-cut a forest, or alternatively, decide to plant new trees in an area that used to be desert, but now they added water, then that affects both light availability and water availability. It also affects nutrients to an extent, especially after a while. So farming tends to increase or decrease nutrient levels in the soil. Whoa, this sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? Well, good farming practices maintain or increase nutrient content. Poor farming practices, such as exhaustively farming the same land over and over without adding fertilizer to make up for the damage you're doing, can result in nutrient depletion and eventual crop failures. This was why so many ancient civilizations collapsed after a few generations. of farming the same land for the same crops over and over again without adequately replenishing the soil. And then after wars, revolution, so on, after a while, with less humans there, the soil eventually starts to recover its nutrient content through growth of, say, weeds, which then get tilled into the soil, restoring the nutrient content, and therefore can be farmed again for a while until the next cycle. Temperature. Global warming is not necessarily a bad thing, for the simple reason that without global warming, well, greenhouse effect to be specific, Earth's average surface temperature would be around negative 15 to 18 degrees Celsius, whereas right now it is around plus 15. So, the process of man-made global warming, on the other hand, is, other than avoiding an ice age during the Industrial Revolution, is for the most part not so good for the ecological system. So it is decreasing suitable habitat for many cool adapted species. Why is this? You might be thinking, hey wait, aren't we defrosting parts of the tundra? Well then, shouldn't like bears just move north? No. Think about how long it took trees to move back after the last ice age, which took many, many thousands of years to actually end properly, like to end completely. It took a long time for the trees to grow back. Why? Because trees can only spread their seeds so far, and then they take many years to grow up to an age where they can spread seeds further. They're not so much like animals. And let's not forget that there are creatures living in the far north, and far south for that matter, as well. For example, polar bears. Alright. So, aquatic systems. Light, nutrient, acidity, temperature, salinity. Wait, why does temperature matter in an aquatic system? Let's think about this. Many insects that live on the bottom of rivers will actually die if you make the river a bit warmer. Why? Well, many aquatic insects have this sort of metabolism pattern. This being temperature, and this being metabolism. So what happens is that as you raise the temperature, even if you don't raise them to death, if you raise the temperature, their metabolism speeds up, and if they can't find enough food to support it, they will starve to death. Just because you heated them up a little bit. And of course, if you go past the lethality point, they just drop dead. Well, this is more or less how enzyme kinetics tend to work. So, acidity. Well, as mankind is exhausting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's actually increasing the ocean's acidity. Because carbon dioxide dissolves in water to form carbonic acid. Well, it doesn't dissolve per se, it associates with water in such a way. Salinity. Well, salting highways tends to cause salt to accumulate, right? And where does that salt drain to? Well, we see that there's storm drains on highways. So, when it rains, all the salt or when the snow melts thanks to the salt, that's why we add salt to highways. When the snow melts, it rinses into those drains. And those drains will have to drain somewhere, right? They drain into some body of water that's usually supposed to be fresh water, but now it's getting saltier, thanks to humans adding salt. And why does salinity matter? Well, there's a reason that people used to salt meat to preserve it. It's because it killed bacteria. There's just so much salt that the bacterial cells just lose all their water, thanks to diffusion, and die. Essentially, this is the same sort of water loss process, osmosis, as is used for preserving mummies. So, can cause salt to accumulate. That's clearly not exactly good, right? Temperature. Well, we already talked about how that affects things. Nutrient availability. We've probably seen pictures of lakes with huge amounts of pond scum just floating on the surface. Yeah, that's because humans have ended up having agricultural runoff go into that lake and causing an algal bloom. So you end up with huge amounts of green slime in some cases. It looks kind of like slime, but in fact it's typically tangled masses of fibrous algae. Of course, when the algae die and sink, they end up depleting bottom level oxygen, especially in thermally stratified lakes. And then the bottom part of the lake becomes a dead zone because there's no oxygen down there. Now, it can also affect groundwater. Human leaching of agricultural runoff is known to pollute groundwater, which of course affects nutrient availability throughout the area that the groundwater happens to feed into. Light availability in aquatic ecosystems, well, if we end up making an area muddier, then there's less light. Of course, right? Especially less light reaching the bottom. In shallower streams, most of the photosynthesis is actually done on the stream bed. So suppose we have a shallow stream or a shallow river. The light can reach the bottom and plants grow along the bottom. This is why at the edge of a pond you see all sorts of plants growing there out of the water. So there may be plants that poke through, and there might be some that stay underwater. Whereas if you have a deep stream or a deep river, this is not to scale. In fact, most shallow streams are actually like this, and most deep rivers are actually wider, like this. So, why are these shallow streams usually narrower as well? Because they're earlier on in the stream course. So, light does not reach the bottom, and a thermocline forms. And essentially, we only have these periphyton, which grow along the sides. And we don't have anything that grows down here. Now, a similar effect can be achieved by making the river muddy. Lots of mud. I don't think I need to explain how mud in water can block light from reaching the bottom, right? Alright, so what about biotic factors? Well, we know that the environment, the non-living environment can change, but so can living ones. So living environment changes, and it might be that a species goes extinct because of a new predator, or because it lost a prey species. So, if it goes extinct upon losing a prey species, isn't the prey species part of the factors that limited the species? So it was a limiting factor. So here we have a diagram of lichen. So it is a mutualistic relationship in theory between algae and fungus. In reality, the algae only get a small share of their photosynthetic products, and the fungi takes most of it. However, it can still be said to be mutualistic, as in benefiting both sides, because the algae cannot survive without the lichen. Or at least cannot survive quite as well, or spread into these environments. Where there is conspicuously, we know that most algae tend to live in water. Conspicuously, do we see any water around here? Well, yes, we do. It's in all the cells. But do we see any bodies of just standing water? Or flowing water, for that matter? No. Here, we see barnacles on a whale. Now, depending on interpretation, the barnacles could slow the whale down, which could mean that they are parasitic. But they could also provide camouflage for the whale, in a way. So, if they do that, then they're mutualistic. We usually reckon barnacles on whales to be commensal, which means that the barnacles benefit, but the whale is neither benefited nor harmed. So these interactions between species are the most common ones. So there's competition. So they fight over the same resource, pretty much. Or they compete for the same resource. Each one tries to get more of it. For example, foxes versus coyotes trying to fight over rabbits or mice. Or compete over them. Humans and mice compete over the human food supply. Predation. One individual feeds on another. Now, usually predation is described as one individual kills and feeds on another. So, lynx prey on snowshoe hares. Depending on interpretation, leeches and black flies can be considered parasitic. But in some areas, the definition puts leeches and black flies in parasitic. In some areas, they're counted as micropredators, because in some areas we don't include the kills and feeds on thing. So parasitism lives on or in and feeds on a host. So tapeworms are parasites of cats, dogs, and even humans. Microbes that cause diseases are mostly parasitic. They're mostly considered parasitic, even if they can kill you. Why? Because they live on or in you. Mutualism. Now, when we think about symbiosis, this is the what we're thinking about, the cooperation type. So, nitrogen-fixing bacteria living in the root nodules, or roots for that matter, of certain plants. Root nodules are a legume thing. There are other plants that are cooperative with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they don't grow root nodules. Commensalism. One individual benefits, the other one does not care. Nothing happens. So this interaction, if we were supposed to write effect on each party, competition is minus minus, both end up suffering. Predation is plus minus. Mutualism is plus plus, both benefit. Parasitism is plus minus. And commensalism is plus 0. And then there is amensalism. So one side does not benefit and the other side is harmed. Humans have many amenso interactions with other species where we just don't care, whereas they are harmed. For example, building a road can often be harmful to other species because they cannot cross between patches of habitat so easily. But for us, well, yes, building a road is beneficial, but building this road here versus over there, we don't really care. So perhaps for us, building a road can be amenso. Usually, it's more like we are parasitic on the planet, or rather parasitic on the environment, but that's not the point. Carrying capacity. So clearly, if there are limiting factors, there must be a limit, right? That's why they're called limiting factors. So if there are limiting factors, there's a limit as to how many individuals of a particular species or a particular population can live in an area. Now, how might we raise the carrying capacity? We change a limiting factor so that it is no longer limiting, that other factors are limiting. Technically, all limiting factors are still limiting, but in higher grades, you will learn that limiting factor is usually used to refer to the one thing that restricts it the most. For example, in most marine environments, like in water, productivity tends to be restricted by either nitrogen or phosphorus. When you add enough nitrogen that it is no longer limiting, you have to add phosphorus to raise productivity higher. And I mean productivity as in the proliferation of producers and how much biomass they assimilate per period of time. So, in summary, many factors place limits on the sizes of populations in an ecosystem. These are called limiting factors, hence limits. Pretty obvious, right? Okay, Tolerance ranges indicates essentially they can survive, but that's about it. The optimum range is survive and reproduce and carry out all their functions normally. Anything that's outside a tolerance range, the creatures will get stressed and die. So tolerance ranges essentially correspond to able to feed for the most part, although that depends on interpretation. You will find that not many things in biology are quite that straight cut, other than extinct, not extinct. And even that is a little bit debatable, given that in theory some extinct creatures can be partially resurrected using close relatives as genetic engineering basis. So, the type of ecosystem that occurs in a particular location is influenced by abiotic factors such as light, water, and temperature. Can we think of some examples? Alright. Why is it that when you build an irrigation program in a desert, you can raise your human carrying capacity by opening up more land for agriculture? I don't think I need to explain. So, deserts are a good example of a type of ecosystem that gets affected by light, water, and temperature, especially water. The temperature and light are just fine. If there were more water, we would have tropical rainforest instead, or tropical dry forest. Tropical dry forest is also referred to as tropical seasonal forest. Please note that the reason why people these days use tropical rainforest instead of just rainforest is because there do exist temperate rainforests. For example, in British Columbia, which is near the west coast of Canada, well, actually it is on the west coast of Canada, that particular province happens to have some tropical, temperate rainforests. Not tropical, sorry. So, species interactions include competition, mutualism, predation, parasitism, and commensalism and amensalism, but that's relatively rare in nature. Why? Because if it happened to not benefit the whole one side, why would they conduct this behavior? Right? I mean, there would be no evolutionary pressure for it. Carrying capacity is the maximum population size that an ecosystem can sustain for a particular species or a particular population of a particular species, depending on the size of your ecosystem. So, humans have managed to raise our carrying capacity by agriculture. And after that, we had the Industrial Revolution and then Agricultural Revolution, i.e. mechanization. And the human carrying capacity may or may not have been reached already. We cannot tell yet. We certainly have not exceeded our short-term carrying capacity yet, but the long-term carrying capacity, well, who knows? Well, that's it for this section. See you later.